My name is Riley Walters. I am the Deputy Director of the Japan Chair here at Hudson Institute. Hudson Institute created its Japan Chair in the spring of 2019 to expand the economic, defense, science and technology, and deep personal connections between the United States and Japan. For today's event, we'll be talking about American and Japanese supply chains. The COVID-19 pandemic delivered a significant shock to our global supply and demand for goods and services. A year ago, we were worried we wouldn't have enough toilet paper and face masks. Automobile sales were replaced by the purchasing of laptops, home office equipment, gym equipment, and personal electronic devices. And we saw a significant slowdown in global trade. Even now, shortages and delays in the supply chain of certain industries persist. There are also increasing concerns about the availability of semiconductors and plastics and so on. And so it's not uncommon to see news these days of another factory temporarily closing or idling because they can't get the parts that they need to finish production. In addition to the supply concerns created by the pandemic, there are increasing concerns, and not just in Washington and Tokyo, about an over-reliance on any single country for production. For example, there's concerns about an over-reliance on China as a source of consumer goods, as Beijing increasingly uses economic coercion to target countries like Japan, Australia, and South Korea, and Taiwan. It's fair to say that the world is recovering from COVID-19, but we're not out of this pandemic just yet. What will U.S. Japan supply chains look like after the pandemic? What steps are already being taken to secure U.S. and Japan supply chains? And how should the U.S. and Japan governments actually think about what it means to build supply chain resiliency? Well, we've got a great panel here today to try and answer these questions and more, but first I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today, Mr. Jingo Kikukawa. Kikukawa-san is the Director of Policy Planning and Coordination Division within the Manufacturing Industries Bureau at the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry of Japan. Japan knows well enough about the negative consequences of supply chain disruption and has been leading some of the discussion on what it means to build supply chain resiliency. And so with that, Kikukawa-san, the floor is yours.
Ravi-san, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm very honored to have this great opportunity to share views and discuss such a crucial issue, strengthening supply chains under the tightened global economy. Before going to the topic, I'd like to, well, on behalf of Japanese people, sincerely express our gratitude for the kind and long-term, but still continuing assistance from our friends, the United States, toward the recovery from the damages from the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami on March 11th, 2011. This year, 2021, is the 10th anniversary of this tragedy. 2 weeks ago, on that Memorial Day, our leaders officially announced the joint message on the passing 10th years since the Great East Japan earthquake. This message says, Japan and the United States will continue to move forward shoulder to shoulder as tomodachi, that means friends, to finish this reconstruction of the Tohoku, northeast region of Japan, and to realize a better future for us all. Well, today's topic is also significant in realizing a better future for us. So let me start. Enhancing supply chain resilience is one of the most important issues that Japan has been wrestling with for many years. For example, Japan depends on foreign supply for most rare earth materials, for which demand is increasing recently for producing components of electric vehicles and IoT products such as batteries, motors, and semiconductors. As you may know, almost 10 years ago, the controversial rare earth shock severely impacted Japanese industry. And Japan faced significant difficulties in procuring rare earths in a timely manner. At that moment, almost 10 years ago, we Japanese government took 3 measures. First, we prepared $1 billion budget to boost R&D activities in order to reduce dramatically the amount of rare earths necessary and to enhance recycling. Second, we secured a large fund and supported JOGMEC, that is Japan Oil, Gas, and Metals National Corporation, to utilize third parties' mines of metals with that fund. Third, we brought this case regarding measures related to export restriction on the rare earth metals to the WTO dispute settlement system. As details, Japan claimed that the restriction made by China are designed to provide Chinese industry that produce downstream goods with protected access to the subject materials. Even though China has argued that restrictions are related to the environmental protection regarding exhaustible natural resources and necessary to reduce pollution caused by mining. But in fact, although it took 2 years, the WTO appellate body supported the Japanese government's claims. Since acknowledging such crucial lessons in the past years, Japan has continued discussions to avoid such problems in the future. Even though Japan has been taking measures to strengthening supply chain resilience, when the COVID-19 pandemic appeared, causing global restrictions on cross-border traffic, supply chains of goods essential for people's well-being and their economic activities has been disrupted. It caused shortage of various products in many countries around the world. Japan also faced this disruption, especially in supplies for manufactured components, rare metals, and medical supplies, including masks and personal protective equipment. These disruptions are primarily caused by the fact that the global supply chains have been left vulnerable or fragile due to a high concentration of the production base. Although there are some companies, such as those in the automobile industry, which are accustomed to taking measures to manage the entire supply chain to be able to respond to emergencies independently. But most companies argue that taking internal measures, such as providing business continuation plans, are inadequate responses, not enough to such unanticipated crises. Based on such experiences, in order to minimize the risk of disruptions to supply of essential goods in the event of unanticipated crisis, we have reaffirmed that it is necessary to establish a sustainable and responsible supply system through diversification of the production base. Yes, diversification of manufacturing sources is effective to reduce the risk. The old wisdom of don't put all your eggs in one basket is applicable to the management of global supply chain. In particular, regarding products essential for people's well-being, it is crucial to secure a domestic production base to ensure their stable supply in case of emergencies. Therefore, last year, the Japanese government has determined subsidies to provide support to voluntary corporate initiatives for the purpose of strengthening their supply chain resilience. There are two types of subsidies. One is the program for promoting investment in Japan to strengthen supply chains, with a total budget of 4.7 billion US dollars. The other is the program for strengthening overseas supply chains, with a total budget is 320 million US dollars. Since the necessary measures vary depending on the type of product, the program offers a variety of options for financial support, not only for the introduction of facilities and equipment, but also for demonstration projects and feasibility studies, so that the businesses can engage in optimal decision-making. The subsidy rate of these programs is 2/3 at maximum for SMEs and half at maximum for large enterprises. The two programs are applied to the suppliers in a non-discriminatory manner, treating domestic and foreign businesses equally, and will be consistent with international trade rules. As for details, we have recently committed to adopt 284 cases in the first stage and the second stage of these programs, which are going to establish their facilities domestically or diversify their locations in order to avoid the supply chain risks and to maintain their flexibility and diversification of their production. Among those 284 cases, there are facilities for producing products such as semiconductors, car components, including batteries for electric vehicles, chemical products, aircraft engine parts, metal materials, alcohol disinfectants, pharmaceutical, and protective gowns for medical use. Through the program for strengthening overseas supply chains, the production bases for manufactured parts, such as car components, have been diversified among several countries, such as in ASEAN countries. As a result of screening from the perspective of how highly concentrated the production bases, the projects are supported within the program include, but are not limited to, manufacturing of climate-friendly products such as electric vehicle batteries and components for renewable energy and products contributing to digitalization, such as semiconductors. With other respect, Japan will support the production of medical gloves by introducing automatic robotics equipment supported by this budget. I believe that these programs have achieved so far specific outcomes that will enable the diversification of production bases for important goods. Japan will continue to support enhanced supply chain resilience, creating and maintaining balance between resiliency and cost effectiveness at the same time. However, the word of resilience is sometimes tricky. Diversification is okay, but 100% reshoring is not realistic. Under our complicated, globally connected economy, we have to pursue diversification to avoid these sources of risks. This is a key point. It is very important that each nation makes effort to diversify supply chains and support one another to complement and strengthen supply chains even more. In order to do so, it is effective to work together as coalition of the willing. And I believe that Japan and US cooperation is at the core of this initiative. As I mentioned earlier, the supply chain issue is crucial for creating a better future. And I look forward to exchange views and further discussion. I really thank you for your kind attention and for providing me with this great opportunity to present my views. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kikukawa-san. That was, I think, reassuring to hear, the perspective that, resiliency really means diversification, if anything, and, sort of pushing back against some of these ideas of 100% reshoring. And I'm certain that the U.S. and Japan will find ways to cooperate, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that, some of those ways now. Again, thank you for your talks. I hope we can have you back here again in the future sometime soon, especially as we go further into some of these more tangible efforts that the U.S. and Japan can pursue. And so with that, let us go to our expert panel today to talk about some of these issues of what the U.S. and Japan can do on supply chain resiliency. So to introduce our panel, first we have Shihoko Goto. Shihoko is the Deputy Director for Geoeconomics and Senior Associate for Northeast Asia for the Asia Program at the Wilson Center. Shihoko is a leading expert on economics and politics in Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, as well as U.S. policy in the region. Next, we have Thomas Duesterberg. Tom is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute. He's an expert of trade, manufacturing, economics, and foreign policy. He leads project work on trade with Europe and China, reform of the WTO, global competition in advanced technologies such as 5G, and strengthening of the US manufacturing sector. And last but not least, from Australia, we have John Lee. John is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute. He is also a senior non-resident fellow at the U.S. Studies Center and an adjunct professor at the University of Sydney. Thank you all for joining us this fine afternoon. With that, I will turn it over to Shihoko.
Yeah, thank you so much, Riley, for inviting me to take part in this very august panel. And it's certainly a timely discussion as well. And we've heard a great deal about supply chain resilience since we've been in lockdown mode over the past year. And as you said at the beginning of this discussion, there have been disruptions on both the supply and the demand side. And much of it has been about really misallocation of goods and the need to readjust distribution. But certainly it has heightened awareness amongst consumers as well as policymakers about the networked flow of goods across borders. And we see some of the consequences even playing out today. We know, for instance, there's a great deal of shortage of containers and cargo coming in from Asia. But for our discussion, we should be very mindful of the fact that there is significant foreign policy implications of these supply chain disruptions. And there is also a great convergence of a national security interest and economic resilience. And that in itself is changing the nature of economic cooperation, as well as competition between the United States and Japan. Both the United States and Japanese companies saw the vulnerabilities in existing supply chains in 2020. But of course, the unexpected disruptions in the supply chains are not new to Japan. As mentioned previously, 2011 was certainly a watershed year for Japan. The fact that in March, there was the devastating Fukushima earthquake and tsunami, which really distorted Japanese exports of critical supplies, especially in the automobile parts and petrochemicals. And then the 2011 Thai flooding that summer also hurt Japanese car manufacturers, car parts suppliers that had headed to Thailand as an attractive overseas production base. And really, these two events that particular year highlighted this need for diversification. And what COVID has done is really push Japanese companies, as well as the Japanese nation itself, to really reconsider what has been instrumental to Japan's global success. That is to say that Japan had been successful in defining lean manufacturing and the specialization of production. But now we see that these strengths can actually be weaknesses, that the just-in-time manufacturing, priority of cost effectiveness and efficiency are actually no longer priorities, and that we actually need to focus much more on resilience to disruptions, including geopolitical risks, as well as natural disasters, including pandemics. And there is also a need to redefine critical goods, what they might actually be, and how they might be protected, subsidized, and stockpiled. It also made clear that to make supply chains resilient was not simply about backing away from globalization, and to simply be self-sufficient within one's own country was not enough. I mean, that would actually lead to higher prices, which is not sustainable, especially since that cannot be passed on to consumers. Consumers expect prices to remain low, and competition ensures that these prices are kept low. So these are some of the common challenges faced by Japanese and American businesses alike. But where we see the potential for greater U.S.-Japan coordination at the national level lies first and foremost in dealing with the China risk. And so, as Kikukawa-san mentioned earlier, Japan has been incentivizing, enhancing its domestic resilience, as well as encouraging greater overseas exports. And this has actually focused a great deal on reshoring outside of China. And that has actually been built on a trend that had been playing out over the past decade. This move away from China, largely initially due to cost considerations, but also in response to political risks. We've seen China's economic coercion rising in recent years. It's all too clear what's going on in Australia. Has been this muscular approach of China to bend its foes to its will through the weaponization of trade. Japan had actually seen that firsthand in the previous decade, In 2010, Japan had been on the receiving end of Chinese export restrictions of rare earths in response to the collision of Chinese fishing and Japanese Coast Guard vessels. And in 2012, we saw anti-Japanese demonstrations and vandalizing of Japanese businesses in China in response to the nationalization of the Senkaku Islands. Japan is hardly alone in facing such the wrath of China. In 2016, China cracked down on Korean businesses, boycotted Chinese travel, as well as export of Korean goods to China in response to the THAAD missile shield deployment by the United States on Korean soil. It actually ended up hurting Korea the most, not the United States, and it exposed the vulnerabilities of the Korean economy. Again, we saw that China can and will weaponize trade as an instrument to exert its power. And COVID has really highlighted a dependence that countries across the world have on China in providing critical goods, not least the PPEs, but also technology-based goods as well. And we also saw under COVID that physical distance itself can be costly from national security purposes, especially when borders are shut down, not because of any nefarious planning, but simply because of the need to ensure national safety. But reshoring of the manufacturing of all critical goods back home is costly, and it's also undesirable. And so there is this need to focus on developing a network of trusted partners, trusted countries. And this is where U.S. Japan cooperation comes into play in developing that circle of trust and developing supply chain networks that are resilient to political risks and natural disasters. And this would actually be part of a defense strategy focused on national security rather than for pure economic gain. We see this in particular in the semiconductor industry, which really does need to have a buildup of this trusted partnership. The semiconductor challenge is particularly noteworthy because we know that demand for chips will only increase in the coming years and decades. And we've already seen during the pandemic just how dependent we are on semiconductors. As we see IoT move forward, we are going to be even more dependent when self-driving cars become the norm, when we are dependent on much faster, greater amount of data control and digitalization of the economy. But at the same time, although we know that we need more chips, the semiconductor industry has a very high cost of entry. It is $10 billion and upwards simply to build a fab. It is a highly stratified industry, which separates itself into different pockets, one for research and development, another for design, and another for manufacturing. And this had actually been a source of tension between the United States and China even before COVID. And we remember that Huawei had been on the US entity list to keep US technology, including US design components, away from the Chinese telecom giant. And COVID has really been a wake-up call, not just to challenge Chinese behavior, but it's also been an opportunity for the American policymakers to reconsider how it invests in enhancing its own production capacity to manufacture high-performance chips. And yesterday we saw the unveiling of a $100 billion science investment plan by the Biden White House. Japan, too, has started a fund to enhance chip manufacturing to the tune of around $1.8 billion. And we are seeing moves by the Japanese government to come up with a roadmap to enhance domestic production capabilities, which is expected by around May. So we are also seeing more concrete movements in the chip sector from both the United States and Japan. TSMC, the world's biggest chip maker, actually got approval from the Taiwanese authorities to move forward with the plan to build a 12 billion fab in Arizona. In February, TSMC inked a deal with Japan to establish a materials research center in Japan as well. Now we're seeing that Intel will be investing about $20 billion to establish 2 fabs in Arizona, which has been reported to be aiming to provide semiconductors for Apple and Qualcomm, which also happen to be the main customers for TSMC as well. We hear that Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo saying this latest Intel investment will help, quote, preserve U.S. technological innovation and leadership, strengthen U.S. economic and national security. So we see that the Americans do actually have a large grand strategy, so to speak, to further its competitiveness in the semiconductor industry. But one of the real challenges in this is going to be to ensure that there is ongoing investment so that these fabs actually remain at the cutting edge, especially when it comes to meeting those defense purposes. The race to remain ahead of the game, to produce smaller, faster, more powerful and efficient chips can only succeed if there is a continuous flow of investment. It is it's a big ask for any government. And there's a lot of concern about whether the United States will be able to make that kind of long-term investment, especially if there is, not if, but when there is a change in government. So now we see that the Europeans too are moving towards their own chip independence. We've been informed that they are aiming to produce about 20% of global chips by 2030. And it is easy, of course, to say that given the current situation, that it's all very well to make such a declaration, but it's not always going to be easy to achieve. But we should stand back and acknowledge that it is not surprising for the European Union to make such a declaration of its ambitions. There is great wariness about the United States, and especially what may or may not come after the Biden presidency comes to an end, and that the United States may not necessarily be a reliable source of semiconductors or indeed as reliable a technology partners as it could be. But of course, when it comes to semiconductors, it's not the United States, but it's actually the Asian companies that are the biggest manufacturers. And really, quite frankly, the world would literally not run without Taiwanese technology. The danger, of course, is the political risk in that. Taiwan, as we know, has been declared as one of China's core interests, together with Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang. It is vulnerable to, very vulnerable to political risk and actual military engagement with the Chinese mainland. It is also susceptible to natural disasters. And one of the interesting things about the semiconductor manufacturing process is that it is a huge user of water, and Taiwan is facing a huge water shortage. So geopolitically, Northeast Asia is especially vulnerable to Chinese economic coercion. And of course, Taiwan is at that forefront, and simply by enhancing arms sales to Taiwan or protecting Taiwan's remaining diplomatic relations is not going to be enough. It's not going to be enough to ensure that TSMC remains a viable partner for the United States, and that there is this huge drive for the United States to be able to produce its own chips. And the same situation follows suit for Japan as well, although Japan and Taiwan have incredibly close ties. And for now, Japan and Taiwan can be expected to coordinate and cooperate on technology, industrial production. The future does actually remain incredibly uncertain. So it is in this light that we are expecting Japan's Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga to visit Washington, D.C. in April. This is following up from last week's visit by Secretary of State Blinken, as well as the Secretary of Defense Austin to Tokyo. At that time, during the Tokyo meetings, they agreed that there were 5 core economic issues that the two countries could cooperate on across the Indo-Pacific. One was, of course, supply chains. The other 4 issues were climate change, clean energy, cybersecurity, and of course, COVID. There is great opportunity for Japan and the United States to work together as trusted partners and to build that network to secure supply chains, and that should include Europe. And Japan can play a bridge building role to boost confidence in that network of like-minded countries with shared economic values, and to work out ways to balance technological independence as well as interdependence. So let me leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the key aspects of, for example, the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy is our shared values that we have, and so I think relying on that will become more important. Up next, we have Tom. Tom, the floor is yours.
Okay, Riley, thanks very much for having me. I want to pick up on the themes of our first 2 speakers in the sense that 100% self-reliance, as Jingo-san said, is unrealistic. But there were powerful political forces in both Japan and the United States to return manufacturing to their own shores, to increase resilience in that way. But I think there are dangers. I think it's unrealistic to think that any of us in the 21st century are going to be totally self-reliant. So I want to, and we have now, as Shihoko-san mentioned, Europe entering the industrial policy game in the form of trying to create national champions in things like computers and quantum technology. So what I want to do is emphasize that what we ought really to be thinking about are synergies between our countries, Japan, United States, also Australia, and perhaps other allies. I think there are many ways in which we can work together fruitfully to increase our own resilience among trusted allies. So I want to be a little bit more specific about certain areas where I think we can achieve some synergies fairly rapidly. And in the context of the ongoing battle against Chinese mercantilism and the undermining of our own industries by subsidization, IPR theft and the like from China, how we can work together to combat that. So let me start with the March 12th event of the Quad which strengthened the free and open Pacific idea. There were 3 general areas for cooperative work going forward. One was vaccine partnership, which I think is self-evident, but I think we ought to emphasize that there are synergies between especially Japan and the United States in pharmaceuticals, but this ought not to be just limited to vaccines. It ought to be in biotechnology in general, and it ought to be a long-lasting project. And also, we should be mindful of our reliance on the chemical precursors of major medicine categories from China that we need to work on. So the second category was climate, working on better technology on green technology. Let me just emphasize something that Jingo-san said about raw materials. China has captured much of the market for raw materials and the processing of raw materials that go into, for instance, electric batteries, but also rare earths, as Jingo-san also mentioned. And there's much to be gained from continuing to work together, both on the acquisition of the raw materials themselves, but also in processing technology. And I believe there's synergies there as well. Japan is a leader in advanced battery technology. And Japan is also a leader in a certain form of semiconductors that are vital to especially the telecommunications industry. That is gallium nitride-based semiconductor chips. Again, China is a source of a lot of gallium, but processing of gallium and transformation into chips is vitally important if we're going to achieve the goals of 5G, because they're much more energy efficient. In order to achieve the cost savings that we need to compete with Huawei, we need to make progress in that area. I think we also, in the climate area, there's another strategy that we ought to, more political, that we need to work on together, which was pushing back against Chinese efforts to convince the world that they're fully on board with the Paris Accord, because as we know, China's the biggest emitter of CO2 and keeps growing by leaps and bounds their emissions, but they're also exporting through BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, coal plants all over the world. So we need to work collaboratively together to push back against China, to call out the Chinese and try to build coalitions to get them to adhere to the commitments that they've made under the Paris Accords. And by the way, I think improving our own technology in areas like solar panels or gallium arsenide semiconductor chips is important and would be politically beneficial to industries and parties in both the United States and Japan. The third area is the Emerging Technology Working Group, and there's a rich arena for cooperation, I think, in this area. And I'd start and emphasize working collaboratively on alternatives to Huawei and ZTE for 5G technology, and looking forward to 6G technology. There's a synergy between especially Japan and the United States, because Japan is good in electronics and infrastructure equipment, radios. The United States is better perhaps in software areas. And there's this emerging technology called Open RAN, or virtual networks, which could achieve the sorts of price reductions in mobile telephony that, for instance, Prime Minister Suga is intently interested in. And already the United States and Japan are collaborating on the Rakuten rollout of Open RAN networks in Japan and other places, including India, which is a huge market for that. I would also note in the arena of technology, we need to work together on making sure that the standards making process around the world is fair, open, and private sector led. The Chinese have started to be very aggressive about flooding the standards making bodies, especially in the telecommunications semiconductor arena. Both Japan and the United States have traditionally relied on private sector-led, technology-driven standards makings. So we need to cooperate there to make sure that China doesn't take over, if you will, the standard making process. Let me just briefly touch on some trade issues. I'm worried about this competitive industrial policy between the United States, Japan, and now Europe, for a simple reason that the most important thing we need to do to reform the World Trade Organization is get a better handle on limiting, disciplining subsidization that especially the Chinese have used so effectively to undermine industries in Japan, in the United States, in East Asia, in Europe. And if we go too far in explicit and highly subsidized industrial policies, it's going to make it very difficult for us to make the argument through the World Trade Organization that China is an outlier. So the other part of that is continuing to work on the trilateral dialogue between Japan, the United States, and Europe, and bringing in our allies such as Australia as well, to achieve the sorts of improved disciplines through the World Trade Organization that we really need to fight back against Chinese mercantilism. I'd also note on the US side, we need to find a political way to work our way back into the comprehensive and Pacific Trade CPTPP, the former Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is going to be a tough battle in the United States. Japan can be helpful. It's the chair, I think, of some group whose name I forget, but this year it's going to be a tough battle for the United States to work its way back into political acceptance for perhaps re-entering the CPTPP. We need to have an alternative, as in many things, to the Chinese, to the RCEP. And so I think our friends around the world can be helpful by working cooperatively with the United States to think through what kind of improvements we could make in the existing agreement that would induce the United States to get back in. Finally, and I imagine John will talk about this, but we need to expand on the U.S. Japan digital trade agreement. There's also a good model in an Australian Singapore digital agreement. We need to expand on that, bring other countries in, achieve a good set of rules that we can then hopefully transfer into more and more countries throughout Asia, but also perhaps through the WTO on things like digital trade and the cross-border data flows. We'll also have to work on privacy issues in the digital world, but with goodwill, we can achieve some great progress there. And I think just to summarize, it's going to be beneficial if we do all of these things for US, East Asian, Australian industry. And perhaps we can regain some ground we've lost to the Chinese. So let me stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I think, I don't agree with all the trade policies that came out over the last 4 years, but I think one of the things that, the US and Japan and the Europeans really started to do well was talk about WTO reform. And I hope we can get back to that soon now that we have our US trade representative and our representative at the WTO All right, John, why don't you finish for us?
Thank you, Riley. And it's good I went after Tom because my comments build on his comments about the Quad. So my purpose for the next few minutes is just to talk about the Quad in the context of US and Japan supply chains. And I think the Quad enters the conversation because if you look at the grouping, it's comprised of 4 Indo-Pacific powers who all share very, very similar concerns about China. And the concerns are not just military, they are about what China is trying to achieve in economic and technological terms, which the panel has spoken about. Now, it's clear that the US and Japan are the 2 most important members of the Quad when it comes to raw material power and technological prowess. They are also the 2 liberal economies in the Indo-Pacific, or the 2 major liberal economies in the Indo-Pacific when it comes to manufacturing, innovation, technological capability, and capital or finance. So the question is, what does the Quad bring to the table in the context of this conversation and securing US-Japan supply chains? So let me just spend a very quick few minutes making the case for the importance of the Quad in this conversation. Now, 1, the US-Japan connection might be the most important bilateral one, but we need to think about a regional and a global strategy to counter China, not just a bilateral one. And Shihoko spoke a little bit about this. This means creating overlapping economic ecosystems, which include as many nations with similar interests and, importantly, similar institutions as is possible. In other words, a bilateral supply chain system cannot effectively counter China or counter China's own Indo-Pacific economic approach, which is underpinned by its Belt and Road Initiative and especially a digital Silk Road component of the BRI. We need a multilateral economic supply chain ecosystem. Second, supply chains are not just about inputs, but they're about the markets they serve. And we need India to be not just a geostrategic counterweight to China, but also an alternative center for demand in the region, and with the supply chains to serve that potentially vast domestic market and demand. The Quad is one way, it's not the only way, and it won't be sufficient by itself. The Quad is one way to assist India's economic integration with the Indo-Pacific liberal democracies through working with New Delhi to chart a course away from still very prevalent Indian inclinations towards self-sufficiency and a closed economy. 3, the Quad is emerging as a way to not just coordinate strategic issues between the 4 countries, but also in areas such as commerce, finance, infrastructure development and financing, and technology, with an aim to countering China. This brings me to the technological aspect, and it's significant that the recent Quad leaders meeting, which Tom raised, announced the creation of a Quad critical and emerging technology working group as one of the 3 priority areas. Now, this working group will focus on enhancing Quad policy coordination in geotech areas. So this is from promoting tech innovation to securing critical supply chains, to ensuring that the future tech is created and governed on the basis of agreed democratic principles and interests. This is a clear effort to respond to China's plan to lure in, capture and monopolize key supply chains within the Chinese mainland, such that regional and global economies become uniquely dependent on China. Bear in mind that in recent years, Beijing's industrial policy is seeking as well to ensure they capture and create the most value. It's not just about integrating whole supply chains, it's about ensuring that they create and capture the most value in the supply chain, either in the production process or with respect to critical and strategic products. The Indian and Australian economies are not as cutting edge as the US and Japanese economies, but the Indians and the Australians do have formidable niche capabilities that can feed into the high-tech or high-value aspects of a democratic economic system. In the case of India, for example, software and big data applications would be noteworthy. In the case of Australia, biotech and advanced materials technologies will be examples. In terms of sectors, I think 5G, big data storage and applications, and even the establishment of the Quad research fund, if you like, to support these ideas may be something worth exploring. It's also worth noting that while supply chains for the production of traditional manufactured goods are becoming more regional and located closer to the end consumer, supply chains in high-tech areas, which are increasingly important, are becoming more global. So bringing in countries with advanced capabilities, such as India and Australia, matter a lot more in this context. Finally, I would make a point about the need to move quickly and set the agenda. Multilateral bodies in a region such as ASEAN are handicapped by a consensus model involving countries with very different perspectives when it comes to the need to counter aspects of Chinese behavior. So ASEAN retains a very strong convening power in a diplomatic sense, but it won't be at the forefront of difficult initiatives such as the need to rethink and reorganize supply chains. Now, unlike the G7, the Quad includes the most populous democratic country and largest low income per capita economy in the world, that is India. This means that the Quad's discussion and positioning on issues is not only informed by the interests of fully industrialized advanced economies in North America, Europe, and Asia, and having that development economy grounding and perspective, I think, is quite an important thing. Moreover, the D10, which includes G7 plus South Korea, Australia, and India, that is a more unwieldy grouping and may not be as agile and as responsive as the Quad in moving quickly and decisively on many of these issues. So I have offered some good reasons, or what I think are good reasons why the Quad should be very firmly in this US-Japan conversation about supply chains. Hand it back to you, Riley. Thank you.
Well, it definitely sounds like there's a lot of opportunities for the Biden administration to use the Quad as a vehicle to push some of these priorities, like supply chain, building supply chain resiliency, and it does sort of seem like that's sort of the direction that they're going. It seems like there's a lot of good stuff happening on the Quad these days, and hopefully something that can continue. Well, with that, I think we're going to end it. Thank you again to our guest speaker, Jingo Kikukawa, and of course to our panelists, Shihoko, Tom, and John. I hope we can have you all back again sometime soon, and I look forward to seeing you all in the near future, hopefully when we're all vaccinated. And for that, that's it for us. Take care and see you next time.
Thanks, Riley.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.